Good morning and happy St. Patrick's Day. Welcome to my live stream. So thanks for checking in. Leave me any comments if you have about Irish food or how you celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Check back in with me throughout the day and we'll be seeing you soon. Good afternoon. It's noon now and it's time for the next installment in Irish cooking with a light flair. So what we're going to do is do a few things to adjust for some different dietary needs. I'm going to be using a gluten-free flour for one version. I'm actually going to make a second version with almond flour. Even though it will still have apples in it, we're trying to make it a little keto friendly. I'm going to be using a sugar substitute, erythritol, and monk fruit today, and I'm still going to use butter, but I am using a dairy substitute. So I'm making a few modifications. One of the things that I found when I tested this recipe out earlier this week was I didn't use a cake pan. I used a loaf pan, and I ended up with a deeper crumb or a deeper batter, and it did not cook right. I didn't have a good texture. Ended up making really good French toast out of those loaves. So not a total loss, but they weren't what I wanted on the way of texture. So we're going to try again today. We're going to use cake pans for this, so that hopefully the narrower width of the batter will give us a nice evenly cooked crumb all the way through. We're using some Granny Smith apples for this, which I've already chunked up and have floating in acidulated water, which is water with a little lemon juice in it. And then I'm going to go ahead and put together my recipe here. I've already measured out my ingredients so that this will go together pretty quickly. So the first thing that I want to do is preheat my oven, and this cooks at kind of a high temperature for a cake. It goes to 375. So I'm going to start off by doing that. All right. So the next thing that I can do is prepare my cake pans, and for this I don't need to flour them. I'm just going to go ahead and butter them. So I'm just going to take a little bit of my butter that I have set aside for my recipe and run it around my cake pan. So I am using real butter today, and I thought about that, whether I wanted to try and use a butter substitute. I'm really not trying to go for vegan or vegetarian. I am trying to cut back on dairy. It is spring here, being, March 17th. And in the southeastern United States, that means pollen season is coming up on us, so I try to avoid as much dairy as I can when that's happening. But this is also a cake, and I really want it to be cakey, so I didn't want to stint on a couple of what I felt like were key ingredients for texture and flavor, and butter was one of those. Now that I have prepped my pans, I am going to combine my dry ingredients. So here I have 3 cups of cake flour, and in this case I'm using my gluten-free pastry blend, which is brown rice flour, white rice flour, and cassava flour or tapioca starch. And then I've added a half a cup of unbleached buckwheat flour to this to give it a little bit more body. So we're looking for cake, not a pastry flour. So I wanted something a little bit more toothy than just the rice flours and the cassava flour blend. So that's what I'm using for my flour blend today. I've got the erythritol and monk fruit sweetener that I'm going to use as my sugar substitute. And so here I have 2 teaspoons of baking powder. I'm going to add that. I have 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. And for an Irish apple cake, as opposed to an American apple cake, there's no cinnamon in this recipe. This recipe calls for cloves and nutmeg. And it definitely has a bit of a different flavor, but it's lovely. And so if you really feel like you need to add cinnamon to your apple cake, you can. But I recommend that you try the clove and nutmeg blend and just see if you don't like that. I think it's a really nice variation on what we are used to having. All right, so those are my dry ingredients. I'm going to go ahead and blend those up. Now, if I had a flour sifter, I would use a flour sifter to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and just stir that all in and get down into it to make sure I've got as even a blend as possible of all of those things. The next step could be accomplished with a pastry cutter, but I'm going to do this by hand, give myself a little bit more room to work. I'm going to go ahead and put on some gloves. And I've washed my hands first. Gloves are not a substitute for hand washing. Little food safety plug there. All right, and I have 4 ounces of butter, which I have cut into squares, and it's very cold butter. So I'm going to mix that in, and then I'm going to take my fingers and I'm just going to start to mix this in and squish the butter into the flour. And eventually I want something that is the texture of chunky sand, fine pebbles. We want to get the flour blended in with the butter as much as possible. This recipe is somewhere between a scone, what we would call a biscuit in the United States, and a cake. It's a sweet, denser cake, and the end result has chock full of apples. The batter ends up kind of sticky, and it's really just an excuse to hold the apples together. So you definitely want to make sure you have enough apples to go into this cake to make it a nice, moist, sweet, you know, it doesn't need a lot of extra sweetener to make it a lovely pastry. Okay, so that's getting pretty close to what I want. Got my butter chunks pretty well blended. Some of them are still a little on the big side, but that's okay. That can get taken care of as we get things blended in. All right, so I'm going to leave that at that stage. I'll go ahead and show that. So now it is time for my wet ingredients. So I will mix in my eggs. And my sweetener. And then about 1/4 of a cup of milk. You might use anywhere between 1/4 and 3/4 of a cup. You want to end up with a sticky, not overly wet batter, but different flours can react differently to moisture. You may need a little more or less depending on what you're going to use. So use your best judgment on that. So I'm going to start adding my dry ingredients into my wet. Blend that in. All right, so I think I'm going to add a little more milk at this point. There we go. All right, now I can finish off with my flour. Now I can add my sticky dough to that. So using my spatula, I'm going to make sure everything is pressed down into the corners of the pan and smoothed out on top. And so those are now ready to go into my preheated 375-degree oven. They're going to cook 45 to 50 minutes. And hopefully that's going to be a sufficient amount of baking time for this thinner cake pan version, as opposed to the ones that I made in the loaf pans that were denser and thicker, and they just didn't want to cook in the right amount of time. So this is, hopefully, everybody keep your fingers crossed, this is going to come out and be perfect this time. Welcome back to St. Patrick's Day Light Fare. There is no St. Patrick's Day celebration that is complete without some cabbage involved. And instead of going the typical route with colcannon today, or a boiled cabbage, we're going to make a cabbage slaw using an Atlantic sea vegetable called dulse. This is dried seaweed. This particular dulse was harvested from the coast of Ireland by a former student and family friend of mine. So this is about as authentic dulse as you can get, but you can buy this in the grocery store with other sea vegetables. So I'm going to take my bowl and add my sliced cabbage to it. This is a prepackaged angel hair cabbage. And then I have finely grated a carrot to add to that just for color. All right, and then this version of coleslaw gets some raisins. I'm using some golden raisins with this one. All right, and then I've got a little bit of slicing to do. One is with a shallot. So I'm going to cut that and then just slice it into small little slices so it will kind of blend in with the rest of the vegetables and give me a nice flavor. Okay, and that goes in with the rest of my ingredients. And then one last thing I want to do, and I want to take my dulse and kind of slice through it too, so that it also kind of blends, because it's going to be a little bit of a salty flavor. I think dulse is my favorite sea vegetable. It's got a very mild flavor. Some people just eat it like a snack, just the dried dulse, which I find a fairly pleasant snack. I'm not as big a fan of things like nori to snack on, although I know a lot of people think that's very tasty too. I have heard of people making a vegetarian DLT out of dulse, lettuce, and tomato, and that makes a very satisfying sandwich. Okay, so that's my dulse, and I've got that chopped up. All of the recipes that I'm doing today are available to my Patreon patrons on my Patreon page. If you're not a Patreon patron, you can check out my page, and the recipe for the Irish coffee is available for everybody to check out, look at. All right, so I'm going to just take a second and mix everything together. I'm getting here with my fingers a little bit. Just get all of my dry veggie stuff all blended before I start adding my other ingredients. And I think what I'm going to do now, this gets a little salt and some pepper. Add some fresh cracked black pepper to this. And the recipe calls for apple cider and mayonnaise. So what I'm going to do is create a dressing with mayonnaise, apple cider, a little bit of apple juice, and a little bit of apple cider vinegar. Just because I think it needs a little more acidity than just the apple juice. So about a tablespoon of each of those. And then I'll mix that together to make a nice sauce. I'm using my spurtle. There we go. It smells good. I love the smell of apple cider vinegar. Okay, there we go. It's got a few lumps, but that's okay. Those will blend right in. All right, so now I'm just going to add this to my mixture. Toss my vegetables and all of that. And then I'm going to let this sit in the refrigerator for a couple of hours while all of those flavors blend together. The salt involved in the recipe pulls some moisture out of the cabbage and lets it wilt a little bit and release some of those cabbage flavors into the slaw and soften up a little bit so it's a little easier to chew. And also rehydrate the dulse because it's a dried sea vegetable. It will soften up and release some of its flavors into the salad as well. Okay, so that is pretty well mixed for now. I'm going to let this sit, let all my dry ingredients mix with my wet ingredients and marry those flavors. And there is my dulse slaw. All right, welcome back to St. Patrick's Day cooking, light fare for St. Patrick's Day. And our next dish up is whiskey braised root vegetables. And I love this dish. It's a very simple braising, which is a wet heat cooking, wet and dry combination cooking with a little bit of moisture and dry heat in an oven. I'm going to go ahead and preheat my oven to 350, and I'm going to talk about the vegetables that I'm going to use here today. And this is an open interpretation. There's a lot of things that you can use here. You can use squash. If you like turnips, you can use those. I particularly like rutabagas and things like this. So I've got a rutabaga here, and I've got another one that I'm going to cut up because that may be a little daunting if you've never tackled a rutabaga before. I have some acorn squash because I found a great looking acorn squash at the store. I have a few carrots. I could use more carrots, but I don't have any more carrots right now, so that's what's going in this one. I did have a nice big bag of radishes, and I really love roasted radishes. Not a huge fan of them raw, but once I discovered roasted and cooked radishes, I was all over that. So this is going to be a nice addition to my batch of vegetables. And then I've got a couple of russet potatoes and a sweet potato that I'm going to add. Then there's a sauce that goes on this afterwards that involves a shallot and some Jameson's, some Irish whiskey, some white wine vinegar, and some Dijon mustard. So those things are going to become part of the sauce later on, but for this one it just gets a little, I'm going to use some neutral vegetable oil. I've got a sunflower coconut oil blend here that I'm going to use, and a little salt and pepper, and that's what's going to go on my mixture of vegetables. So I'm going to go ahead, and I have a pan over here that I'm going to start putting my vegetables on. That's one of my rutabagas. That's my squash. There's my little bit of carrots for color, my radishes. Okay, now that I see what that looks like, I think I'm only going to use one potato and maybe not my sweet potato. So I'm going to go ahead and peel this potato. Yeah, I didn't. If I had bought an organic potato, I would leave the skin on, but I'm not going to do that. I didn't buy an organic potato, so I'll go ahead and peel this and then cut it into similarly sized chunks, about 1-inch chunks here, because I want everything to be able to cook at the same rate. I want it to cook evenly. If I had some chunks that were smaller than others, they might get overdone or burnt or just fall to mush. I don't usually add onions to this because they will get a little mushy, to get all of the root vegetables cooked in. Okay, so go ahead and give myself and I'll have chunks that are similarly sized to the other things that I have chopped up. I'm going to cut a couple of these radishes in half just because they're a little bigger than other things. Okay, that's pretty good. All right, so I have room in there for another vegetable or two. So let's talk about our swede. So when this comes out of the ground, it's dipped in paraffin wax. So it's got a very thick, waxy coating. And then there's a fairly substantial peel, and under the outer peel, there's an inner peel. And you need to get through all of those layers to get down to the swede or the rutabaga underneath. So I'm gonna go ahead and start off by cutting off the end, and then I can show you how you've got all of these layers. You've got this waxy coating on the outside, and then you've got the peel, and then if you can see this inner ring, here, this is the inner peel that you have to get past to this flesh underneath. This is the part that you want to eat. You don't want to leave this outer peel. That tends to be bitter. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off the other end. It's also a pretty substantial vegetable. And then I'm going to do what's called a supreme cut on this. And because it's a round vegetable, this is the same thing I would do as if I was cutting an orange. It's a round vegetable, so I want to cut around it and curl my knife while I am cutting. So I'm going to start inside of that peel, both peels and the waxy coating, and I'm going to angle my knife, and as I cut, I will turn my knife this way. So here I go. And end up underneath it so that I have an even cut all the way around the body of this round vegetable. And this is called a supreme cut. There we go. So there's my peel, and waxy coating. In fact, I think I will take a moment and clear my cutting board of all of this wax before I cut up anymore, because I don't want that involved in my stuff. But there is the peeled rutabaga. So that's how far down we want to get. Give me a moment. Let me clear all these peels and wax and all of this other stuff. Gosh, that made a mess. Now I can do the same thing to my rutabaga that I did to my potato. Cut it in pretty decent sized slices. Large dice. That's what I'm going for here. And there we go. All right, so I'm just going to drizzle a little bit of oil on this now. Just a light coating. It doesn't need to deep fry in all of this. And then some salt. And pepper. I think I'll throw in a little white pepper as well. Okay, and then we want to add about a tablespoon or a capful of whiskey to this and just drizzle it over everything. This will give it a little bit of whiskey flavor. Most of the flavor that we're going to get from the whiskey is going to be in the sauce, but we want to add a little bit to this, and this helps with the braising, adding a little liquid to this. So now I'll give all of this a toss. If everything gets coated in everything we just put on there. There we go. I can tell you it smells good. The addition of the whiskey just gives it a really lovely aroma that's going to bake into these nicely and be reinforced, I guess is a good word, when we make the whiskey sauce. Okay, that's it for the whiskey roasted vegetables. They're going to go in a 350-degree oven for probably 35 minutes or so. I'll start checking them and poking them to see when they get done. I'll take them out. I don't want them to get too mushy, but I do want to make sure everything gets done. The radishes will take a little longer. The rutabagas will take a little longer. So we want to make sure everything gets a chance to get nice and evenly roasted. So that is that. Now, one other thing I want to talk about before I sign off for this hour is the salmon, which is going to be the next thing that we do. And so it gets a preliminary sprinkling of some kosher salt. So I have given these 3 pieces of sprinkling. We were talking about this a minute ago, these 3 different pieces of salmon. These 2 are farm raised and this one is wild caught, and you can really tell the difference in the color of the wild caught. And this one's still a little frozen, but it's got a pretty firm flesh, whereas the farm raised ones are a little squishier. But we're going to use all of these for our slow roasted salmon. So they've got a sprinkling of kosher salt on them now. They're going to sit for about 30 minutes with this on before I start rinsing them off, and then we'll be ready to work on these at the next live stream, which will be 6 o'clock. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you when we're ready to go with our next dish. Good evening and welcome back, and thank you for following along today as we have been cooking Irish food on a lighter side. So we've come to the main course of our meal, which is going to be a slow roasted salmon. Now the nice thing about this salmon is, well, it's delicious for one thing. It cooks in a slow oven, so it takes 15 to 20 minutes for a thin piece of salmon, but it makes really delicious cold salmon the next day. So make a little extra so that you've got some to make into salmon patties or into salad or something to use it for the next day. So in the meantime, before I jump into that, let's talk about our roasted vegetables. They have come out of the oven looking pretty delicious. Here we go, nice and colorful. We're going to be eating these once the salmon is done, so I'll throw these back in the oven for a few minutes just to heat them back up so they're just this side of done enough. They're plenty tender to eat right now, but they could go a couple more minutes and not take any harm. And then I have made the sauce to go along with that, and this is the whiskey sauce that is shallots that have been sauteed in some vinegar with some mustard and chives added in there, and then after all of that has cooked together a bit, turned off the heat, and then had some butter melted into it. So that's my sauce that once I have reheated my roasted vegetables, I will toss them in this lovely sauce, and those will be all ready to go. Oh, it also has whiskey in it, of course. Okay, so for our salmon then, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make an herb sauce, a lemony herb sauce. And the herbs are things that you can play around with. You can use flat leaf parsley and other types of things. I went out to my garden this morning, and what I had growing was marjoram and oregano, and so I got a bunch of that. I was able to find some cilantro, but not flat leaf parsley when I went shopping. But I also have some really nice celery leaves, so I'm going to use those as part of my herbal component. So I've taken all of the big stems off, and I'm going to chop these up. You can use a food processor if you like and make a much smoother sauce. And then I'm going to whisk it into some neutral flavored oil. I've got some avocado oil here, along with the zest of a lemon and the juice of that lemon and some garlic, some chopped up garlic. So I'm going to mince my herbs. It's already starting to smell really delightful. So that looks like a pretty decent mince. Now, I've already got my oil in here. I think I'm going to add a little more oil because since this makes a good cold salmon for the next day, I've got a couple of extra pieces of salmon. So we'll add a little extra oil there. And now I'm going in with my herbs and my zest from my one lemon. My chopped garlic. Let's add some cracked black pepper to this. Oh, I guess it's going to make a difference if I take the lid off. Sure enough, it's like nothing's coming out of that. All right, we'll add some salt to that. And then whisk all of this together and add our lemon juice to it. All right, and that's kind of a paste that we're going to use to paint on the salmon. And that's now ready to go. So I'm going to take a little oil, and I have lined a sheet pan with some foil. I'm just going to rub that around. All right. This is our salmon that earlier I had laid out on a tray, and I had kosher salt on it. I've rinsed the kosher salt off, and I have patted these pieces dry. And so now I'm going to lay them out here. Here we go. And we were talking earlier about how we can tell the difference between a wild-caught salmon and the farm-raised salmon. You can really see the difference there. But once we get our sauce on top of them, you're not going to be able to tell quite so much. So this salmon has already been sliced into some pieces, and so I think what I want to do, there it is go ahead and make some cuts along my other pieces of salmon, just so that my sauce can get down into the meat and really get those flavors where we want them to be. Here we go. All right, now I'm going to preheat my oven to 275 degrees. All right, and now I'm going to take my sauce, but not all of it. I want to reserve a little bit of it at the end to be able to freshen that flavor up. So I'm just going to take a pretty decent sized spoonful and spread generously over the top of each piece and kind of press it down in so it gets in those cuts that I just made. Make sure I leave enough to do my little refresh at the very end. Okay, so go ahead and spread this out so it's over all of the flesh. There, that's going to be really nice. You're trying to hide out here. There. There we have it. Okay, so now this is going to go into my 275 degree oven. It could be 250 to 275, or you can roast it a little longer at 225. It kind of depends on your oven and how accurate you can get it when it's at those lower temperatures. You might want to test it out with an oven thermometer a few times. Just kind of open the door every few minutes and see how hot your oven is actually getting to compare to what it's set at before you try something like this, because you don't want it to be too hot, because it kind of negates the purpose of this. So this is going to go in the oven. It's going to roast until it's at an internal temperature of 135 degrees, and then I'll let carryover heating take it from there, which is not going to give me a medium rare salmon, but this has been frozen farm-raised salmon anyway, so I'm not really concerned about a medium rare salmon. I'm really after the cold salmon for tomorrow anyway. So we're going to go ahead and let this get to about 135 degrees, and then heat up our winter vegetables. Our dulse slaw is in the refrigerator and it's coming along very nicely. The very last thing that we're going to do is make some salmon cucumber crack with our roasted salmon and some Irish coffee, and then we're going to be ready to eat. All right, so here we are at our final installment of light cooking for Irish food for St. Patrick's Day. And I want to show you, my fish has just come out of the oven. Here is my slow roasted salmon. I have my meat thermometer in here and it is currently reading 135 degrees, so that is what I want. I can also tell my fish is done because when I poke on it, it's got a nice firm texture to it, so we are good there. So what I have is a little bit of my lemon and herb sauce in reserve, so when we serve that, we can drizzle a little bit of that on there. And I'm going to take this tail section here and make a few little pieces out of it, and then I'm going to show you my salmon cucumber crack, which usually I do with a smoked salmon, but since I have this lovely salmon right here, I thought I would demonstrate it here. So I'm going to take some cream cheese and I'm going to add a little bit of horseradish to that, because that's a really happy flavor combination with salmon and cucumber. So we're going to mix all of that together. And this comes together really quickly. And I have some cucumbers here, and I have some sliced radishes, and I tell you that I went ahead and took some of my roasted radishes and sliced a few of those just to get the color in there. Okay, I can smell that horseradish in my cream cheese. Nice, light, just enough. So now I'm going to put a little schmear, a dab, if you will, on each one of my pieces of cucumber. All right, so that's our first and second layer with the cucumber and the horseradish cream cheese. And now I think my next layer is going to be my radish slice, just for some nice visual color. There we go. And now I can take my little bits, and I don't want the skin, I want to leave the skin behind, and I can put just a little bit, a cube of my slow roasted salmon on each one. So we have a nice little salmon cucumber crack bite. Crack is a Gaelic word that means party or fun or hanging out with your friends, having a good time. So this makes a really good idea for something like an appetizer. So when you're having a good time, hanging out with your friends, having a few tasty beverages, then this is your snack. Okay, So now I've got herbs on top of this fish already, but I kind of like to put a little garnish on top of that, and you could do that with a cocktail skewer, some microgreens at this point, some lemon zest if you wanted to. There's all kinds of ways you could dress this up. I have some fresh marjoram here that are tiny. They kind of qualify as microgreens. So I'll put one of those little leaves on top of each one. Get a whole leaf so that it's pretty. There we go. All right, and there is our salmon cucumber crack. Really quick and easy, especially when I've got my salmon roasted right here. If I had some smoked salmon, I would definitely do that with that as well. So that is that. Here is my slow roasted salmon. Here is the dulse slaw we made earlier that's been marinating and letting the raisins plump up and the dulse absorb some liquid. And it's got a really lovely flavor that might be a little hard to identify. What is that extra little flavor in there? But the dulse really brings a nice little smoky something to the party. Here is our apple cake. I'm going to throw my vegetables in the oven really quickly, and as soon as they have had a chance to heat up, I will toss those with my whiskey sauce. And then there is one final thing that I want to do by way of tasty beverage hour. We've had a variety of different tasty beverage hours, but I want to make a traditional Irish coffee. Now, the first thing that you start off with is a nice rich coffee. It's nighttime right now, and so I'm starting with a nice decaf. And some people may say that there's no such thing as a nice decaf, but just run with me here. So the next thing that would go in a traditional Irish coffee would be sugar cubes or brown sugar. And since we're doing light here tonight, I'm going to use an artificial sweetener. I used monk fruit and erythritol earlier. I'm going to use xylitol for this one. I like to use xylitol in my coffee. This is what I use in my coffee in the mornings. So we'll make it sweet. We'll put a couple of those in there. And then add my coffee. And we don't want to fill it up more than about 3/4 of the way, because then we have to add the Jameson's Irish whiskey to our Irish coffee. And I'm just going to put a little dribble because that's the end of my bottle. And then we'll mix that up. And then for my final layer, I have some whipped cream that I whipped up a little while ago, and there's no sweetener in that. That's just straight whipped cream. Make sure it's kind of stiff peak because I want it to hold up when I put it on top of the hot coffee. Now, is this light? No, not particularly, but there's no sugar in it, so it depends on what you're trying to avoid. If you're doing keto, then the whipped cream is no problem at all. If you're trying to avoid fats, then yeah, you might want to do something like a whipped topping that's low trans fat. So you can make these variations. Okay, so then what I want to do is take my whipped cream and float it on top of my Irish coffee. Ooh, almost got a shamrock going there. I almost managed. We'll call that a shamrock. We'll, even though that was kind of an accident, we'll call that a happy accident. And so there is my beautiful Irish coffee, my decaf Irish coffee with a pittance of a taste, a smidgen of the Jameson's in there just to give me the flavor. Okay, so There's my Irish coffee to go along with my Irish apple cake, my Kerry apple cake, which came out really nicely with my gluten-free flour. The cake pan depth is the perfect depth for this cake. It is a cross between a biscuit and a cake, so it's a little denser, but it's very nice, and the apples are just the right amount of sweetness to it. All right, here is my whiskey sauce that I cooked earlier, and we should have some warm vegetables now. Okay, there's that. And then here is the sauce. Oh, and they smell so good. And that's just a lovely combination with the buttery whiskey sauce on top of all of these lovely roast vegetables. And there's really not that much fat involved with a sauce like that, just tossed in at the end. So we've still used some butter, we've still used some cream, we've still used some apples and some other things that might be a little less than light. But again, it depends on the diet that you're following, whether you're trying to avoid gluten or keto or whatever that is. But there are ways that you can make adjustments to whatever diet that you're doing. Normally I would have been making a lamb stew for St. Patrick's Day, but I thought a nice roasted salmon would be a lighter option. And it's a really good one too, and it allows me to make my light cabbage slaw, my low-calorie and gluten-free apple cake, my salmon crack, and my roasted vegetables, and of course my indulgence at the end with my Irish coffee. So happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.